The Trumpet Daily with Stephen Flurry.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the show. Well, Bojo has not lost his mojo. What a night. Last night we're going to be talking about it, breaking it down with our very own Richard Palmer, I guess you could say the tide in the affairs of Britain, or maybe we can say that Britain is now riding the Trump tide. We've got some fascinating clips to listen to. And I'm sure most of you are very well aware of the big news from the UK last evening, the historic election, a political earthquake, really, a massive victory for the Conservative Party, something, at least the size of it, that they haven't seen in something like 35 years. So just an amazing victory for Mr. Boris Johnson and his Conservative Party. As I say, Richard Palmer will be here with us in the studio for the first segment to break it all down for us and to help us understand the significance of this development. We'll also later on in the show talk a little bit more about the ongoing impeachment saga in the United States. And then for the end of the program, we'll be talking about the subject of government. I touched on it just yesterday, or maybe the day before, referring to Romans 13 and verse 1. Certainly, there's a lot of commentary that we offer on this show and at the trumpet.com website about government. But as you can plainly see when looking around this world, man's government has not been able to solve the problems of this world. Only God's government will do that. So we'll get into that and some quite a few scriptures on that subject a little bit later on in the show. Well, Richard, I guess my first question for you is, how were the Russians able to pull this off?
Yeah, that's quite an impressive achievement to inflict, I guess, what was it on Labour, the biggest defeat since 1935? I didn't realize the Russians were this powerful.
There is actually a story by, who is it? Glenn Simpson, right? Yeah, the Fusion GPS fame, or infamy, I guess you could say. He actually had a piece at The Guardian today saying that we need a Mueller investigation here in the UK because he's convinced he's been, well, I don't want to get into it. I want to focus instead on the huge win. Maybe we can first just talk about the you kind of alluded to it there with the failure of Labor, but maybe we could try to wrap our minds around just how stunning this was last night. The Conservatives, as you said in a piece, I don't know if it's at thetrumpet.com yet, but winning seats that they haven't won since World War II. Right.
Yeah, I think, going into this was people saying the most uncertain election in modern history, and nobody really trusted the polls. Nobody knew what was going to happen, and to kind of go in there thinking the Conservatives might lose this, and then to come out with, I think we're looking at either 76, 78 majority is a massive turnaround. And it's something, at least for a Conservative government, we've not really seen even in my lifetime, that there's been a Conservative government that's come in with this kind of majority. And you've just had this whole heartland up in the north that's typically been kind of the heart and core of Labour territory, where it's almost in people's blood, where they vote Labour and their parents have voted Labour and they'd never even think about voting Conservative. Some of those places have turned, and there were some indications that it would happen, and I think there were some polls that showed it could happen, but it's still pretty stunning to see it play out.
Yeah, you mentioned your lifetime. I think Boris Johnson in his acceptance speech, this is clip 6, but he's talking about the audience that he's addressing, saying, a lot of you haven't seen this in your lifetime. Clip 6.
My friends, good morning, everybody. My friends, well, we did it. We did it. We pulled it off, didn't we? We pulled it off. We broke the deadlock. We ended the gridlock. We smashed the roadblock. And in this glorious, glorious pre-breakfast moment, before a new dawn rises on a new day and a new government, and I, of course, want to congratulate absolutely everybody involved in securing the biggest Conservative majority since the 1980s, which was literally, as I look around, literally before many of you were born. And with this mandate and this majority, we will at last be able to do what? You've been paying attention. Because this election means that getting Brexit done is now the irrefutable, irresistible, unarguable decision of the British people.
That's Boris Johnson actually this morning giving his, not his acceptance speech. He had a shorter speech last night when he won his seat. But then that was him this morning, I think about 7 o'clock, talking again about not having a conservative majority like this since the 1980s. Pretty amazing. It was a horrible night for the Labour Party, the worst result for them since 1935. So some historic numbers, as I say, and I'll play here a montage that kind of sums it up. This is taken from the BBC's coverage from last evening, clip 8.
Our exit poll is suggesting that there will be a Conservative majority of 86, and that will be the biggest Conservative majority since Margaret Thatcher's third victory back in 1987.
If this poll is anywhere near right, you've produced your worst result since 1935.
Yeah, if it is anywhere near right, that's right.
In 1989, Russia's Berlin Wall came down. In 2019, Labour's Red Wall came down.
I would like to thank Boris, because
this could build a new Conservative majority across Britain for another generation.
Mr. Snell, how is it looking for you tonight?
Oh, it's disastrous.
Well, you'll see immediately that the board gets washed in blue.
When you look at just how bad these results are, this is not just a defeat for Jeremy Corbyn, this is a defeat for the politics that he represents.
This is obviously a very disappointing night for the Labour Party with the result that we've got. I want to also make it clear that I will not lead the party in any future general election campaign.
and I hereby declare that the said Boris Johnson is duly elected.
Well, by a majority of 149, the party leader of the Lib Dems, Jo Swinson, has lost her seat in Dunbartonshire East to the Scottish National Party.
For millions of people in our country, these results will bring dread and dismay, and people are looking for hope.
6 minutes past 5 in the morning, and we are now in a position to say that this election of 2019 formally has been won by the Conservatives.
That's a montage from the BBC, and really the bad news started right away last night as they all released the exit polls. I guess the polls closed at 10 p.m., and then it was right after 10 p.m. when the exit polls came out and said that I think the final results are actually not quite as bad as the exit poll, but it's still pretty bad. And then when the official results started coming in, the way that it was really fascinating to watch. I didn't watch it all through the night, but when it was like they were all in a gymnasium or a community center counting the votes, and then all the contestants, 4 or 5 of them, were there at the back of the stage as the individual announced them. It was almost like it was a school assembly and they were announcing the citizen of the week or whatever. But they're all there, and it made for some dramatic video as some of these, I guess the red wall up north, over here, the blue is conservative and the red, that's Labor. So it's opposite in the U.S., with the red being the more conservative party. In any event, when some of these labor communities started to go over to the direction of the conservatives, the crowd was on hand to express their feelings. This one here comes from Blythe Valley, which is up north, and you'll hear the results of the conservative win. In Blythe Valley is pretty much a labor stronghold. Right. Yeah. All right. Here's clip 9.
Susan Elizabeth Jungworth, Labour and Cooperative Party, 16,728. Ian Levy, the Conservative Party candidate, 17,000.
There's a new MP, Ian Levy, winning his seat over a Labour candidate. Maybe before we can step back and look at the bigger picture on just as you explained to me this morning, the power of Boris Johnson now and his party. There were some other developments. The SNP up in Scotland had a really good showing, and some were immediately saying, or I think even the Nicola Sturgeon was saying, that this means we need another referendum on Scottish independence, because in Scotland they don't want to come out of the European Union. Obviously the Conservative Party now does and will by the end of January, they're saying. So the Conservatives can certainly do what they need to do, but does this vote for Scotland, the SNP party picking up a few more seats, does this mean that they're going to have another referendum on independence?
I think it means it's going to be a big controversial topic from here on out, but they have to get the Prime Minister's permission, they have to get Parliament's permission in the UK before they can hold an official, properly counted and everything referendum. So they said, I think that they're going to push, and I think they've even said maybe even before the end of the year they're going to try and push for that. The Conservatives are indicating that they're not going to allow it because they're saying, well, look, we just had one a few years ago. We said it was all over, all the literature everywhere. This is a once-in-a-generation vote. We can't hold a once-in-a-generation vote and then hold another one 5 years down the line and just allow you to keep calling these until until you get the result you like.
Right.
But they've got such a big majority. They've got, I think it was 48 seats out of the 59 or somewhere around there. 48 out of 59. Yeah. So they're going to be they're really going to capitalize that and say, well, Scotland's demanding another referendum. Look how much they supported us. And the Conservative government is going to be saying no, and I think you can really rely on them to use that to kind of stir up a lot of animosity for the next 5 years, and you could still have this deadlock, but I think they'll make it a big issue.
Right, and then we heard in the montage there, Jeremy Corbyn will be stepping down as leader of the Labour Party. So, what's the latest on what will happen with him and the Labour Party in the months ahead?
Yeah, that's something that is developing pretty quickly where, as you heard in the montage, he said, I'm not going to run another election as Labour leader, but he did not say he's stepping down right now. And so that statement of, well, I'm not going to lead another election as a Labour leader, that's not good enough for a whole lot of people in the Labour Party. So he said, I'm not going right away. He's saying that he wants there to be a pause, a period of reflection, and then have a step down. But there's a lot of people in the Labour Party trying to get rid of him now, more than there's been before. There's one headline here from the Telegraph just saying that maybe he'll be able to cling on until spring. But definitely he is on his way out.
So we'll talk more about Corbyn and just the negative campaigning and the media and all that in a little bit as well. But as far as Boris Johnson and just the power that he now has, you were saying earlier today that there's just a huge difference between a prime minister that has a majority like this, something like 80 seats over the majority, and someone that just has, which is what we've seen in the last few years, someone that just has a slim majority and that has to have everybody on board if they want to pass legislation. So maybe you could talk for a moment just about what this represents for Mr. Johnson.
Right. I think it would be easy to look at the election result and say, well, we've had a Conservative government in the UK in some form for the nearly last 10 years. We've got another Conservative government. Nothing much is changing. But I don't think that's the case. You've had for the last 10 years, we've had Conservative, the first Conservative government under Mr. Cameron was in coalition with the Liberal Democrats. So a whole lot of right-wing things that they wanted to do couldn't do it because of the Liberal Democrats. The next time he did have a majority, but it was still much slimmer. Then you had Theresa May with just a razor-thin majority. We've not seen a Conservative government with this kind of majority since Margaret Thatcher. So, under Theresa May, basically one guy and a few friends could say, I don't like this law, I'm going to vote against it, and they could block it. Under Mr. Cameron, I think maybe like a dozen people, but still, it didn't take very many people to do that. under Mr. Johnson now, when you've got a majority of 80, you have to have a pretty sizable percentage of the Conservative Party say, no, I don't support this, I'm going to block it. And so, the checks and the balances system in the UK works very differently to the way in the US. And basically, Parliament can do whatever it wants. And that's the fundamental principle of sovereignty over here, is that it's the king in Parliament. So now, if he wants to get rid of the Supreme Court that kind of had its fairly ridiculous anti-Brexit ruling a few months ago, he could do that. If he wants to get rid of the license fee system for the BBC, he could do that. The biggest limitation is probably just himself and his will and how far he wants to try and push things. But he's got a whole lot of power now, and we just haven't seen a Conservative government with this kind of power. We saw a Labour government with it under Tony Blair, and they pushed a lot to radically transform just the relationship between the government and the people and dramatically expand the government. Mr. Cameron couldn't roll that back, really, because he just didn't have the majority to it.
Yeah.
So
he's
got a lot he
mentioned
could do.
The two previous ones. I've lived here 5 years, so when we got here, Mr. Cameron was in power. Then after the Brexit passed through in 2016, then Theresa May came to power, and then Boris Johnson, I guess, earlier this year. Then there's another election just last night, obviously. So, I mean, you haven't quite been on the pace as Israel as far as an election every 3 or 4 months, but there have been a lot. Mm-hmm. Then last night happens, he gets this majority, and all these commentators are saying he's going to be in power for the next 5 years. So why is his position now so secure? Is it just because that he has such a comfortable majority that there's not going to be a need for another election? Or 5 years, I guess there must be some sort of, like with the U.S., every certain amount of time there has to be an election?
Right. 5 years is the max, is the limit. So, when we had a coalition government, there is the big question mark of, is it going to last 5 years? With Theresa May, she felt like she needed another election because she only had a small majority. She wanted to gain a bigger majority, so that kind of pushed her to go to elections early because she just felt she couldn't get anything done. That failed. Boris Johnson had to do it again because you had people quitting the Conservative Party or getting kicked out, and he lost the majority. He couldn't get anything done.
Right.
Now, though, with a majority of 80, he is going to be able to get things done.
Yeah, and it also just shows how fast things have changed, because we were writing even about just how dangerously close we were to Jeremy Corbyn gaining power, and now he's going to be gone. And then it wasn't that long ago when the Conservative Party was deeply divided. You had the half or so that wanted Brexit or a hard Brexit, and then you had the other half, Theresa May being one of them, that was just kind of half-hearted about Brexit or didn't even really want Brexit. And then now, do you get the sense that he has a really strong majority, but do you feel like he's unifying the Conservative Party?
I think at the moment, there's people that are willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. I still think there's a lot on the right wing of the Conservative Party. I think when he kicked out all of the 20 or so kind of on the left wing, on the pro-EU wing, I think a lot of people were kind of impressed by that. And people who are on that right of the Conservative Party, the kind of people that would be thinking of leaving to vote for the Brexit Party or to UKIP, I think he kind of won them over with that. But at the same time, I don't think they're fully convinced. He does talk, even in his acceptance speech, he talked a lot about, our top priority is the NHS and the National Health Service, and when we need to do a lot to cut carbon emissions and to be carbon neutral by 2050. And so I think a lot of people are looking at him and saying, well, is he going to be a really red-blooded Conservative leader or not? And they're willing to ask the question, they're willing to wait, but I could still see potentially some splits emerging as time goes on, and if he does seem to stick to some of those things he said in that victory speech, and just keep going with this spend and cutting carbon emissions as his top priorities, him starting to lose some of those on the right wing.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, and we'll talk in a little bit about the similarities between him and Donald Trump, but that is one that I see that coming in, you really didn't know if Donald Trump was going to be, just kind of a liberal Republican or someone that's more conservative. Well, you look at his policies 3 years in, and he's established a lot of really conservative principles and or policies. with Boris Johnson, you kind of get the same feeling with him coming in, that he, like you said, climate change, and he's obviously going to be a big spender and all that. But I guess it remains to be seen if he's going to be more, traditionally conservative. But before we get to that, what about the just the overall media coverage? You would expect coming into this that they were just really going after the conservatives in every way that they could. And in the article that you are posting today at thetrumpet.com, you talked about how that they just, even to the point of lying and things that we've seen in the United States as well. What were they doing coming into this that was dishonest or mean-spirited or nasty? And then we can talk after that about the way they reacted to the results last night.
Well, I think Channel 4 News was the biggest example of this, where they were really pretty openly on the left this whole election. They held a climate change debate for all of the leaders, which I think just even holding a debate on that one single issue as opposed to anything else, that kind of shows a left biased. And Mr. Johnson didn't come to that. He sent the government minister that's responsible for climate change instead. They didn't let him come on. They replaced him with an ice sculpture and had that melting away. There was another time where Mr. Johnson was giving a speech and he said, well, I want people of talent to come to this country, but we need to impose some democratic limits on that. When Channel 4 put that up on social media and they put in a caption, they changed the word talent to color. I want people of color to come to this country, but I want to put a democratic limit on that. So they made it sound like he was saying, well, we want to limit the number of people of color that come to this country. There are about 20,000 different people tweeting about how he was racist before they kind of finally came out with an apology and like, oh, sorry, he didn't actually say that. And you just had this whole pattern of things from Channel 4. And then the BBC, I think they obviously have their left bias for a long time, and they're just huge. When you look at where people get their news from, for so many people, the BBC just dominate that market here in the UK. And you've just seen so much from them pushing like this picture of the baby. This went around all over the social media where there was some boy on the floor of a hospital, and apparently
Boris Johnson's fault. Of course.
Yeah, and that just was the biggest story, I'd say, in the few days in the run up to the election. And then of course over here, Mr. McDonald's made this point, and I've been chatting to him, that there's no Fox News. If you want some kind of right-wing news program, it's not there. I mean, there are newspapers, just
print media.
Yeah, there are some good right-wing print media, but on TV, there's nothing.
Yeah, I like this one from the Telegraph. The left poured a bucket of bile over the Tories in this election. They portrayed them as heartless monsters from the Black Lagoon, bent on selling off the NHS to Donald Trump. And if these figures I'm looking at are real, then it hasn't worked. So here again, and Mr. McDonald, you mentioned him. He made the point this morning how that the result of this election also just highlights how out of touch the ruling class, the elites, are with the ordinary Britons who obviously turned out in droves last night. But coming into last night, I know I did mention yesterday, you gave me some stories about how it was really, there was a lot of uncertainty, but there were also quite a few publications that were suggesting it was going to be another hung parliament, that it was going to be the razor thin, margin. And yet it turns out to be the Conservatives in a landslide. I will say, pleasantly surprised at the tone of the coverage. I did, as I say, I watched a fair bit of it deep into the night, and then I saw it this morning when I got up as well. And I was just thinking back to 2016 when the American media reacted to Donald Trump's victory, and you could just visibly see it on their faces and their tone. And there were commentators saying that this was going to be a nightmare. And you could obviously tell that some of the reporters at BBC and elsewhere weren't especially happy, but at the same time, they looked professional. They seemed like they were trying to convey, if anything, it was a little understated. So maybe that's just a difference too between Americans and Britons, but for whatever reason, they didn't seem like there was just a total and complete meltdown. Was it the same in print media, or you obviously sent me a few stories from the Telegraph, like the one I just quoted from there, but did you see anything else in what you read this morning that just had people kind of hyperventilating that this is the end of the world?
Some. I mean, it just depends a lot on the print media. I've got some of the different headlines in front of me here. I mean, the print media does tend to be, they wear their opinions very openly on their sleeve. So the Daily Mail's headline was, "Rejoice, Boris surges to landslide win." So obviously there's no subtlety about who they're supporting. But then I think the one that did have the most... Oh, there we go. I like the Daily Express. "The British lion roars for Boris and Brexit." But the Mirror is probably the one of the most dramatically left-wing publications. Their cover was "Nightmare Before Christmas."
All right.
So you did have your hyperventilating. And then Twitter. I mean, Twitter is one of the big places where I think there's been a lot of left-wing coverage coming from the election. I was on Twitter yesterday, and this is one of the things that made me nervous, where they have their trending hashtags, and every single one was about voting Labour or voting against the Conservatives. It was like hashtag stop the Tories, hashtag youthquake, about getting the youth out to vote for Labour,
Right.
hashtag vote Labour. Today, I think the number 2 or number 1 hashtag is hashtag not my government. So there definitely is still that side of things that, I mean, I don't know how on earth they could paint. I mean, they've been saying ever since Boris Johnson came to power, well, he's not my prime minister. He was only elected by just the Conservative Party members. Until there's an election, he's not legitimate.
Right.
At this point, I don't know how you claim that this government isn't legitimate, but there does seem to still be that push among the left.
Yeah.
And you see that with that hashtag and some of the way some of the left-wing journalists have responded.
Yeah. Lastly, as far as the parallels here, well, I guess we can touch on prophecy right at the end as well. But as far as parallels with what's happened in the United States, of course, you go back to 2016 and you have the Brexit vote, which was actually a few months before the election of Donald Trump. And Mr. Trump, by the way, he tweeted out, "Congratulations to Boris Johnson on his great win. Britain and the United States will now be free to strike a massive new trade deal after Brexit." It says this deal has the potential to be far bigger and more lucrative than any deal that could be made with the EU. Celebrate Boris, he said. And of course, he's in the process right now, Mr. Trump, of finalizing the deal with Mexico, or the new NAFTA. And if there's another one now coming right on the heels of that, I mean, this could be short term. This could be good news for both sides of the Atlantic. But here's a U.S. commentator. This is Laura Ingraham on Fox News last night, talking about the significance of Mr. Johnson's win and how she compares it to Donald Trump. Clip 1.
There was another event that shows the enduring power of the movement Donald Trump created: economic nationalism, sovereignty, independence from international bureaucracies, and controlling one's own destiny. Well, that movement is sweeping through the UK tonight, where the globalist anti-Brexit Labour Party is on track to suffer a resounding defeat in parliamentary elections, making the UK's exit from the EU a certainty. Now, just like the elites in our own country, the ones who want Trump out, the elites in Britain believe that they knew better than the voters. The globalists worked for 3.5 years to try to turn public opinion against Brexit. Remember, they voted for Brexit in a referendum. Well, guess what? The elites failed miserably. Now, this also means that Donald Trump will soon have yet another trade success on his hands. His administration will proceed to strike its own deal, a bilateral one, with Britain. Excellent news for the U.S. economy. It's going to be great news for Britain. Here's hoping that the results of this UK vote presage Trump's re-election as the original Brexit vote did the first time around. You see a Boris-Trump friendship like Thatcher, Reagan, not exactly the same, but very interesting how we have this similar track.
Not exactly the same as Thatcher and Reagan, but she obviously is talking there, not using the words that we have used, but she's talking there about a resurgence. Thatcher and Reagan, the 80s, and then now here we are with Boris. If he's, Mr. Johnson, I should say, if he's solidified for 5 years, and then all signs are pointing toward President Trump's reelection next November as well, then these are the two for the foreseeable future. These are the two. And then when you think of all the prophecies that, and you touch on this in the article that we're going to be posting at thetrumpet.com today. Just the two, I don't have time to get into all of the specifics, but for one, what Mr. Armstrong and what we've said following that about Britain not being in the European Union or in the seventh and final resurrection of the Holy Roman Empire. And then, of course, the other prophecy that factors in here is the, as I mentioned, the resurgence, the Jeroboam end, and God temporarily saving Israel for one final short stint of time to give our people a chance to turn to God in repentance. And as you bring out in your article, this obviously takes us right through to the point of Britain being out of the European Union, just like Mr. Armstrong said as early as 1956, I think it was. And then, of course, it's also, like Hosea 5 brings out, it looks like it's going to bring the UK right together with the United States, and that the UK will then go the way of Jeroboam as well. There's other prophecies, obviously, that we could talk about as well. But some breaking news from the UK, a really significant election from last night, and we thank Richard Palmer for coming in and helping us to wrap our minds around it. You're listening to Stephen Flurry, and this is the Trumpet Daily Radio Show. If you'd like to email the program, you can send comments to td@kpcg.fm. We'll be right back.
This is KPCG-FM, and this is the Trumpet Daily. Is prophecy real? Is it anything more than a collection of imaginations, vagaries, and wishful thinking? The answer is no. Human beings have never dreamed up an authentic prediction of the future. The human mind simply isn't capable of it. Such a feat would require godlike power. What about Bible prophecy? Is Bible prophecy real? Is it different than the litany of other failed prophecies that have been discarded throughout human history? Unlike other books, particularly those books that claim to predict the future, the Bible has endured for thousands of years. Something about this book has transcended thousands of generations of human history. And this book, the Holy Bible, claims to predict the future. It claims its prophecies come not from the minds of human beings, but from the mind of their Creator, from the mind of God. Prove the Bible's prophecies for yourself. If you cannot honestly prove them to be true, discard the Bible and move on with your life. But if you can, what a spectacular book the Bible becomes. Request Herbert W. Armstrong's free book, The United States and Britain in Prophecy. This book will examine the core Bible prophecies and compare them to history and current events. More than 6 million people have requested this amazing and easy-to-read book. Order The United States and Britain in Prophecy by Herbert W. Armstrong and prove Bible prophecy for yourself. Email your request to td@kpcg.fm or visit thetrumpet.com. From the Philadelphia Church of God campus in Edstone, England, this is the Trumpet Daily program with Stephen Flurry.
Well, I'll have to delve back into the impeachment saga on Monday so that I have enough time here for my Bible study heading into the weekend. I try not to cut back on at least the Bible study for the Friday show, as I know that this is the program that many will listen to through the weekend. So in any event, there's going to be, I'm sure, plenty of news, plenty of news stories and sound bites and such next week when we talk more about the attack on the U.S. Presidency. Well, mankind in general has been wrestling with questions associated to forming government, or how to establish government, or how government functions. We've been wrestling with questions on this subject for thousands of years, And of course, there's no shortage of different types of government. Richard was there with us in the first segment explaining about how things work differently here in this nation as compared to the United States, where you have the 3 branches of government. And there's many other types. I guess they come in, as Mr. Armstrong explained in the World Tomorrow book, if you look at it more broadly, you have republics and limited monarchies and then the communist states. But there's, of course, different strains and varieties within those broad categories as well. And I mentioned earlier this week, too, Romans 13 and verse 1, that verse that says, "For there is no power but of God." It is, of course, it's Satan's world, 2 Corinthians 4:4. And so if it's his world, then all of the governments that we see in the world today, you can't look at them and say, well, that's God's government there, and this one over here is not God's government. They're all man's governments. They're all of man, as influenced and inspired by the devil. But the point that this brings out here, Romans 13 and verse 1, is that if God allows it, if he allows it, then we ought to be subject to it. As long as we don't have to disobey God. If you look at God's word, if you look at the Holy Bible, it teaches us all through the pages of the Bible that we ought to have respect for authority. This is a short quote from the Good News, 1964. "There can be no power except as God allows. The Bible does not teach that this world's governments are righteous or representing God, but so long as God allows them to wield an authority he established, even though they wield it contrary to his laws, to disrespect the government is to disrespect God." We do have to watch and pray always, and even warn this world. And if you look at the prophecy in Amos 7, there's a confrontation coming between God's church and a government in this world. And of course, you can look at the Bible itself, whether in the New Testament with the Apostle Paul and, of course, Jesus himself, the prophets of old, the warnings that Jeremiah, for example, gave, right there standing in the gate of Jerusalem. I mean, reaching the city and the nation or the national authorities even. They too need to be warned, but that doesn't take away from this fundamental lesson that's taught throughout the Bible that we ought to have respect for and even submit to the governments that are over us, even national governments. They're not God's government, as that quote brings out. But at the same time, you look at some of the laws that are put in place, even if there are too many of them. There certainly are things, just to take one example, like traffic laws that we would all very much appreciate. You don't want it to be like it is in some nations where there are no rules or regulations when it comes to driving. It's just like a free-for-all. But when you think about the problems, the troubles of this world, the solutions, man hasn't been able to come up with them. Man hasn't been able to find the solutions to solve the problems. All of the governments of this world are flawed. And it does just remind us, the more we watch, it shows us just how much we need the government of God. Isaiah 59 and verse 4, the prophet says, "None calls for justice, nor any pleads for truth. They trust in vanity and speak lies. They conceive mischief and bring forth iniquity." That's what we see so much of in the world today. Now, we can be very thankful in nations like the United States and Great Britain, where there is more freedom, and we can obey God without being interfered with, for the most part. There's a lot of nations where you just don't have that opportunity. But that said, There is a lot of corruption, even in our nations, as we've covered so often on this program. There are, as Richard just said in the first segment, there are people who are not going to accept the results of an election. They're going to do everything that they can to try to undermine it or to say that it's not legitimate. It's happening in the United States, and I'm sure it'll happen here. Here's Glenn Simpson this morning writing at The Guardian saying that the Russians influenced the UK election. That was exposed as a fraud in the United States. It was exposed even this week. All of his sources, Christopher Steele, the report they put together, and then the IG report comes out on Monday and says that was just a total fraud, just hearsay, just someone hearing something and then putting together a report. And that's how they started in on the spying, on the hoax. So it's exposed as a fraud in the United States. And here's Glenn Simpson over here. He's now taking the same narrative, the same exact story, to go after the government in the UK. Verse 7 says, their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed innocent blood. Their thoughts are thoughts of iniquity. Wasting and destruction are in their paths. Our thoughts are just on, like it was before the flood. Genesis 6, verse 5. It says that the minds of individuals, of men, were on evil continually. We certainly see a lot of that today. The way of peace they know not. There's no judgment in their goings. They have made them crooked paths. Whosoever goes therein shall not know peace. Man hasn't been able to find peace, the way to peace. We talk a lot about it. There's even some leaders, like my father has said, that do a pretty good job of identifying problems. But where are the solutions? Maybe there's a temporary surge of economic growth here or there. But on the whole, when you look at the way we're spending in the United States or in Great Britain, how much longer will it hold? How much longer can we sustain this? In the World Tomorrow booklet, it says, governments promise peace but bring wars. They promise benefits for the people and then extract from the people the cost of the benefits plus excessive costs of government. Government promises are empty. Every election cycle here in the UK, you can be sure that the NHS, the National Health Service, that's going to be right at the top of the agenda for both parties. It needs more attention or care or concern. It always needs more funding. And so the government's going to provide it, some will say. Well, then look at your your paycheck stub and you see how much it costs every single individual. A huge tax. And then the system, the quality of it just continually declines. It says the people are the pawns who fork over the money in order to get a part of it back. We fail to find in human government any knowledge of life's purpose or dissemination of the true values. We talk about solving the problems of this world. We talk about peace. In some cases, diplomats and such will work really hard for peace, for some kind of an agreement. Neville Chamberlain, he worked hard for the piece of paper that he got from Hitler in 1938. He was shuttling back and forth, trying to get a handshake deal out of Adolf Hitler. It didn't work out. It didn't work very well. We work so hard for peace. And then we go out and say, peace, peace, but there is no peace. Just like the prophet said, the prophet Jeremiah. Mr. Armstrong said, when we take a hard, cold, realistic view of conditions and trends, they do point inevitably to a fast approaching world crisis of combined nuclear war, starvation, uncontrollable disease epidemics, crime and violence, and the extinction of human life on this planet. If you just take a long, hard, cold, realistic view of the conditions and the trends of the world, what do you see? We see a lot of evil. We see a lot of filth. Now, Satan has a way of trying to make it look like it's something that's wonderful. It's alluring. It's enticing. Verse 10 says, we grope for the wall like the blind, and we grope as if we had no eyes. We stumble at noonday, as in the night. We're in desolate places as dead men. Mr. Armstrong said, today, as in ancient times, too many of those who seek offices of power over the people of cities, states, districts, or nations promise great benefits, pose as public benefactors, while their inner motives are ambitions for personal power and wealth. They promise the moon, but really it's about their own selfish pursuits, their own selfish desires. Well, there is a solution. It's described in your Bible in great detail. Isaiah 59, we just hit a few of the verses there, describing the many failures of human government. But then verse 20, it says, and the Redeemer shall come to Zion, and unto them that turn from transgression in Jacob, says the Eternal. The Redeemer shall come. Verse 1 of chapter 60, it says, arise, shine, for your light is come, and the glory of the Eternal is risen upon you. That's the future that we all have. Jesus Christ returning to this earth. That's in our immediate future. That's what we're watching and preparing for. Watch and pray. We want to know when that time will be. We want to know when that hour will come. Look at Acts chapter 3. Acts chapter 3 and verse 19. This again is a prophecy, just like Isaiah 60 is there, of the arrival of our Redeemer. Acts 3:19 says, repent you therefore and be converted, that your sins may be blotted out when the times of refreshing shall come from the presence of the Eternal. That time of refreshing, it's talking about a revival, and it's brought on by the presence of the Eternal. It's brought on by the arrival of Jesus Christ. Verse 20 says, and he shall send Jesus Christ, which before was preached unto you. God will send Jesus Christ. Send him again. If I go, he said, I will come again. So all the prophets wrote about it. The apostles anticipated it. Paul wrote about it in terms like, when he comes, I'm going to rise up in the air to meet him. Paul wrote like he thought it was coming in his own physical lifetime. He did think that at one point. And that's the way God inspired him to write it. You can read that in 1 Thessalonians, by the way. Verse 21, it says, whom the heavens must receive until the times of restitution of all things, which God has spoken by the mouth of all his holy prophets since the world began. The heaven must receive him until the time of restitution, the restitution of all things. As Herbert Armstrong used to explain, it means the restoration of God's government to this earth, God's family government. What an awakening this will be for the whole world to finally have their Redeemer on hand in Jerusalem, ruling this world. How will he rule? This is over in Revelation 2, in verse 26. It says, and he that overcomes and keeps my works unto the end, to him will I give power over the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron, As the vessels of a potter shall they be broken to shivers, even as I received of my Father. You can read in Isaiah 9 about Christ's coming government. What we see here in Revelation 2 and also in chapter 3 is that the saints are going to rule with Jesus Christ. This is what we're being prepared for. We're in training. Training to rule. Being trained to rule with Christ. Verse 21 of Revelation 3, it says, "To him that overcomes will I grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I also overcame and am set down with my Father in his throne." We're going to rule with Christ. We're going to rule the same way that Jesus Christ rules. This is why it's so important for us to learn about God's government, to embrace God's government, to love God's government. God's family government. We have a booklet that goes by that name. It's a powerful, powerful booklet. A message that I reviewed, I should say, recently. A fantastic message. It's a theme that runs right through the Bible, from beginning to end. And the return of Christ is, well, that's the turning point for this world. That's when we go from the kingdoms of this world, influenced by Satan the devil, the god of this world, to then becoming the kingdoms of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Revelation 11 talks about that transition. And Zechariah 14, of course, speaks of his return to this earth, to the Mount of Olives. Verse 4, it says, "And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof, toward the east and toward the west, and there shall be a very great valley, and half the mountain shall remove toward the north, and half of it toward the south." So here is Jesus Christ setting foot on the Mount of Olives, and there's all these dramatic, literal earth-shaking, these dramatic events surrounding his return. Verse 5, it says, "And you shall flee to the valley, or through the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach unto Azel," it says. Yes, you shall flee like you fled from before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. It says, "And the eternal my God shall come, and all the saints with you." All the saints coming with Jesus Christ. Those who are dead in Christ, rising to meet Christ in the air. A resurrection from the dead, a resurrection to spirit life. And then those of us who are alive and who remain physically at the return of Jesus Christ, then we'll have our resurrection to spirit life as well. Verse 7, it says, "But it shall be one day which shall be known to the eternal, not day nor night, but it shall come to pass that at evening time it shall be light, and the eternal," this is verse 9, it says, "And the eternal shall be king over all the earth. In that day shall there be one Lord, and his name one." See, here is described the government of God. There's one supreme ruler, but at this point, there's just one supreme ruler on earth. This will be God's government, headed up by the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And of course, Jesus Christ's first action is to take this army that he returns with and to forcibly put down every form of resistance against God's government. And you can continue reading in this same chapter, Zechariah 14, about what happens to those who resist against the government of God. Their flesh just melting away or being consumed by a curse from God. And then by the end of the chapter, you see people coming in and out of Jerusalem to observe the feast days of God, the commandments of God. And if they don't, again, they're going to bring curses on themselves. This is how God establishes his government on this earth. Finally, after man has tried everything you could imagine and then some, and of course failed in every effort, with every attempt. But here is the perfect government of God, ruled by the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, ruling alongside or along with his bride, the wife, the first fruits, who are in training now to rule together with him. You're listening to Stephen Flurry, and this is the Trumpet Daily radio show. If you'd like to email the program, you can send comments to td@kpcg.fm. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for joining us all week, and we'll see you next week.
Freedom is one of the most sought-after ideals in human history. Man's search for freedom has taken him